to my channel. So today I wanted to share with you a review and swatch video of the Master by Mario palette. I also wanted to compare it to the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette, so if you're interested in seeing how these two palettes compare, then just keep on watching. So the Master by Mario palette originally launched on the Anastasia site. That's where I was able to pick mine up. It's no longer available on their site, but it is available online at Ulta, Sephora, and Macy's. And it's going to be in stores at Sephora and I believe Ulta later this month. And this retails for $45. It's a palette that has 12 shades and they're all neutrals, and they also comes with a brush just like all of the other Anastasia palettes. The Mario palette is a little bit smaller than the Modern Renaissance palette. The Modern Renaissance palette does have 2 additional shades. It has 14 versus 12. And the Mario palette is the same size as the old Anastasia palette. So I have the artist palette here. You guys can see it's the same size. The actual pans are the same size as well, except these old palettes were $30 and this one is $45. So it did up the price a ton over like the past year. This did come out 2 years ago, and then slowly with time the palettes did increase in price. The Modern Renaissance palette was $42 and it is bigger. This is more expensive. It's $3 more for $45 and you get 2 less shades. I'm not really mad that the price increased. I felt like it was a matter of time before it became more pricey because Anastasia does have a really awesome formula. And $45 is around the same price range as a Naked palette or Chocolate Bar palette. So you're paying just as much money for like the same amount of product. The only difference is that this is cardboard packaging compared to some other palettes. So you're not paying extra for any packaging, you're just paying for the actual product. So I don't really mind paying a couple extra dollars to get consistent shadows across the board compared to having like 3 shadows that don't really show up as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the swatches. I'm going to zoom you guys in and swatch all of these individually. Alright, so I'm going to swatch the shadows one row at a time, and we're going to start with the top row, and the first one is Hollywood. Next you have NYC. Then next you have Kim. And then we have Muse. And then next is Marina. And Claudia. So those are the top 6 shades, and you guys can probably tell as I was swatching them that they do have a bit of fallout, but they are all very pigmented and very, very consistent. So moving on to the second row. So the first shade is Lula. Next we have Isabel. Next is Violetta. Next is Fifth Avenue. Then we have Bronx. And lastly, we have Paris. So there you can see the second row, they all swatch very consistent as well. It has the matte shades, they're all really, really pigmented. The matte shades don't have as much fallout as the shimmer shades, but they still have a little bit of fallout because they are very, very soft. So all of the shades in the palette are very, very consistent and very pigmented. I feel like when you just look at the palette, it looks super neutral and just a lot of the colors look very similar, but there are definitely differences between a lot of the shades, especially once you get into the differences of different finishes between satin and shimmer and matte. So those are all of the shades in this palette, and I'm going to go ahead and swatch the Modern Renaissance palette so you guys can see the comparison of the colors in this compared to that palette. So here are all the swatches of the Modern Renaissance palette. You can see it's a lot of purples, burgundies, and oranges. There's not as many shimmer shades, and there's also not as many light shades. And then here you guys can see compared to the Mario palette, there's a lot more warm shades. I would say that pretty much every shade in this palette is warm. Compared to the Anastasia palette, you can see there's a lot more neutral shades, and there's even some cool tone shades in there as well. I wouldn't say that there's even a cool tone shade within the Mario palette, so I do see a lot of differences. There's some similarities between like the orange and brown shades and some of the shimmers, so you do see some similarities. It just kind of depends on what your interest is in an eyeshadow palette. There's definitely a lot more warmer shades, a lot more shimmer shades. I feel like there's a lot more shades for your lid in this palette compared to the Modern Renaissance. you're going to have a lot more transition shades, a lot deeper shades in the Modern Renaissance. And definitely if you prefer shimmer shades and like to have a lot of options for a lid color, then definitely the Mario palette would be your best bet. If you like more deeper shades and like having some cool tones, then you're going to have a lot more options in the Modern Renaissance palette. Alright guys, so like 7 makeup wipes later, I'm starting off with a clean slate to go over some of the shade comparisons between the both palettes. And you guys can see that some of like the matte shadows are pretty similar, and there's also some similarities between the shimmer shades. I'm going to start off with the 2 shades that are the most similar. And the first one is Lula from the Mario palette. This is like this warm, not warm, it's actually a more neutral brown shade. And then that's pretty much identical to Warm Taupe in the Modern Renaissance palette. Once I swatched these both, I really could not tell a difference. So those are both very, very identical. Like once it's on my hand, I really can't tell which one is which I don't really mind because that's like a transition or crease shade. It's not going to be anything special that I'm going to put on my lid or is really going to stand out to me in an eye look. And then I want to compare Cypress Umber to Violetta. These are the darkest colors in the palette. Cypress Umber is a very neutral, dark chocolate brown. Violetta has more of a warm tone to it, and it's definitely not as dark. So these are both the darkest shades you're getting in the palette. This reminds me a lot of Fudge from Anastasia. And neither of these palettes have a black shade. And in the Modern Renaissance palette, I did not mind at all because I could just use this to like deepen up any eye look. And Violetta I don't think is dark enough to do that or have that same purpose. So with Cypress Umber in the Modern Renaissance palette, I didn't mind at all that there was no black shadow in the palette, because I felt like this shade is deep enough and it's also a neutral shade. So if I just want to make a look darker, this is a really good color. With Violetta, because it is warm, if you're trying to make a shade or an eye look darker, once you apply this color, it's also going to make it more warm on top of that. So it's not a neutral shade. So I prefer to have a shade like Cypress Umber. And I definitely like Violetta for like a crease shadow, but I don't think it's going to be as versatile as Cypress Umber. Next, I'm comparing the 2 orange shades. I have Burnt Orange in the Modern Renaissance and then Isabella in the Mario palette. And Isabella is the darker shade. It is more warm, so those are not very similar shades. And then 2 similar shimmer shades are Antique Bronze and Muse. Muse is the one on top. It's a lot more shimmery, has more copper to it, and then Antique Bronze has more purple to it. I really prefer the shade Muse over Antique Bronze. I'm definitely going to apply that on my lid. Antique Bronze just didn't have enough shimmer for me to, it wasn't like as interesting of a color. I feel like I definitely like the shade Muse better. And then the last comparison I'm going to make is these 2 shimmer shades, Primavera and Fifth Avenue. Those are the most similar shimmer shades in the palettes. And then Fifth Avenue is from the Mario palette, that's what's on top, and then Primavera on the bottom. Primavera is definitely more champagne and Fifth Avenue is a bit more golden. So those are all the shades I'm going to compare between the 2 palettes. If you look at them, you might see some other similarities, but once I swatched them all, those are the ones that were the most similar, and the other ones swatched weren't as similar. So there are definitely similarities, but I think they were different enough to get both palettes. And also all the shades that are in this palette are shades that I really, really love and I know I'm going to use. So overall, I'm really happy to have both palettes. I think the pigmentation is very consistent between both of them. And I know a lot of people were very hesitant about this palette because it's the definition of a warm neutral palette. There's no like deviation within that. It's a very neutral palette, but it's also not just like a basic brown palette. Like there is a lot of colors that are just more neutral colors. Like these colors over here that are more like champagne, gold, burgundy, green, and blue. They are neutral still and very wearable, but they're not just like plain colors. They are unique shades. And also in the Modern Renaissance palette, I told you guys on Snapchat, if you follow me on there, that I use this palette so much, but I don't use any of this. So basically I just use all of these neutral shades and then these shades, and those are very similar shades as the one in the Mario palette. So if you're like me and you don't use like the neutral or cooler tone shades within this palette, you're probably going to find more shades that you'll use from the Mario palette. So overall, I can't really say that one palette is better than the other. It just depends on what shades you prefer. I use the Modern Renaissance palette several times a week, but I only use like 5 or 6 shades. So if you want to use more shades and you like those similar shades that I pointed out, then I would pick up the Mario palette. The Modern Renaissance palette does have a few advantages to it, in my opinion. It has a darker shade that is more neutral, and then it also has a lighter shade. I can live without the darker shade in the Mario palette because it does have like that dark warm brown, and I like to use a warm brown a lot of times. but it's going to be really hard to not have like a cream shadow or like a cream base. In this palette, the lightest shade is Hollywood, and that's already a gold. I really wish that they had a color to like set your eyes with, or just use as a very neutral light shade. So that's the only thing that's really missing from the Mario palette, because I know that every time I do my eyes I'm gonna have to use a different shadow. I did go in today with Tempera from the Modern Renaissance palette, but then the rest of the shadows I'm wearing are from the Mario palette. Alright guys, so that's everything for this video. I hope you enjoyed seeing my review of the Mario palette and how it compares to the Modern Renaissance palette. This palette is out of stock right now, but it's going to be restocked within the next few weeks. And also I did a whole review video on this palette, and I'll link it down below. In my description bar you'll also find 2 open giveaways as well as all my social media links, so make sure you're checking out my description bar for all of those things. So please let me know which palette you would prefer in the comments down below, and if you like this video make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll talk to you guys soon in my next video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.